Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm Dr. Marjorie Allison, the chair of the English department, and I want to welcome all of you to our first face-to-face event in 2 years. This is fantastic. Woo! And it's fantastic that we're hitting it off with Ayana here to help us celebrate all kinds of things: music, writing, everything WIU. So I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate you coming out on a Friday afternoon, evening. I am going to turn it over to Dr. David Banish, who has done the real work in getting this event off. And I'm so glad that he came to me and said, I want to do this, and I want to do it face to face. So here we go. David.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. We are here in part because of a gift from Fred and Lola Austin Case that endows our Case Writer in Residence. And at these events, our creative writers who usually run these events always give a nod to the folks that gave this generous donation that allows us to bring in 3 to 6 writers a year and celebrate their work and introduce their work to the WIU community and the wider world. So I'd like to acknowledge the Cases for that amazing gift to us. And the gift that makes it possible to bring to you today, which is our amazing speaker, Ayana Contreras. The Department of English and the entire Western Illinois University community is delighted to welcome alumna Ayana Contreras back to campus today for the first time since 2006. Ayana majored in English and minored in broadcasting. During her years at Western, she was focused on ambitious reading, honing her skills as a writer, developing the skills of a popular culture deep diver, and learning the radio business. While at Simpkins Hall, she was learning the shape of world literature and practicing creative writing. Across campus at Salee Hall, she was learning how to run a radio station as the program director of WIU's own 88.3 The Dog. Just as important as what she was doing in class, she was also continuing to develop her lifelong practice as a record collector and archivist of popular culture ephemera. Today, Ayana Contreras is a cultural historian, a memory worker, a radio producer, a DJ, a writer, an artist, and an archivist. An avid collector with over 9,000 vintage vinyl records. She hosts Reclaimed Soul, the radio program on WBEZ, when she also serves as the director of content at Vocalo Radio in Chicago. She is a columnist for Downbeat Magazine, the world's premier jazz magazine, and her writing has also been published in other major magazines, both in print and online, including the Chicago Review, the Oxford American, Bandcamp Daily, Lit Hub, amongst many others. Ayana was the 2014-15 University of Chicago Arts and Public Life Artist in Residence. In 2017, she received the Clementine Skinner Award by the Vivian Harsh Society and was chosen as an Association of Independents in Radio New Voices Scholar for 2015. Today, we are particularly excited to celebrate her new publication, her book on post-civil rights era cultural history, entitled Energy Never Dies, Afro-Optimism and Creativity in Chicago, published this past December by the University of Illinois Press. Please join me in welcoming Ayana Contreras back to campus.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's been a very long time. I was trying to remember, was this always blue? I don't know. And if so, why? I don't actually wear glasses. I just thought this is what you're supposed to do when you're doing a reading. So here we are. I was sort of between what I wanted to read. So I went with this particular chapter, which is almost an outlier in my book. My book really details sort of Black Chicago more broadly, South and West sides. But this particular chapter, one that a lot of folks have told me they really enjoy, is really digging deep into the culture of the West Side. And it's called Sort of a Dream, the Southern Sensibility and Flow of Chicago's West Side. That's also what you're supposed to do, right? All right. Black Americans are grapefruits. Hear me out on this. In the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, I suppose, there was the genus citrus. Let's say all of us Black folks stemmed from there. Today at your local grocery store, a shopper is likely to see a grapefruit alongside a banana and imagine that the world has always known this plump, ripe fruit full of flavorful juice, sweet yet sour. But in reality, grapefruits are a hybrid of dubious, unplanned origin. It was first described in the late 18th century, a Creole fruit found in the New World. We know that they're genetically citrus and that they're derived from the pomelo and the sweet orange, which itself is a hybrid fruit. But that's where it gets fuzzy. By the looks of things, we are pomelo, right? Presumably, but not precisely, Nigerian, perhaps. From Mali, conceivably. We are Black, but somehow not precisely African. What is certain is that we are a commodity, our bodies splayed out for consumption, our juice, our joie de vivre, constantly harvested. Sometimes I feel as though I'm uncommonly perishable, like my lips are made of fruit flesh, skin like a grapefruit segment, just waiting to tear. The thought builds and I imagine I'm on a collision course for unnamed doom, a villainous breakdown. Then I wake up. I realize it's only sort of a dream. Everything is passing away, peeling away like citrus skin, a breath away from death. Man comforts himself with the idea of archiving. Archiving assumes victory over death. We die anyway, though selected remnants remain. What we save may last forever, but it may prove to be absolutely useless to the future, at least in its present state, or the medium may rot in wait, leaving scarcely a fragrance behind. Around the time of Chicago's storied blizzard of 1967, which dumped 23 inches of snow over the course of 35 hours, out in San Francisco, the first human be-in, or be-in for short, occurred in Golden Gate Park. Once Chicago had thawed out, on Mother's Day of that year, a be-in was held on the north side in Lincoln Park, followed by a happening on the south side at Promontory Point. The be-in at Lincoln Park was fairly well covered by the media of the day, but its south side cousin left barely a trace of evidence behind. But it happened. And the whole Sunshine and Daisies hippie counterculture narrative is particularly striking, set against the backdrop of Chicago, where just a year earlier, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched for open housing. In fact, King stated to reporters in 1966 that, quote, "I've been to many demonstrations all over the South, but I can say that I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago." The human being took place in San Francisco, cast with a whole bunch of lost children and intellectuals. They didn't have the immediate crush of history weighing as heavily on them. Those folks had the luxury to just be, flowers in their hair, seemingly untethered to the heaviness of the past. Chicago's beings had a bit more subtext, the ongoing racial tension that exploded the following year, mired in grief, class and race-based struggles that often manifested themselves in union tussles and block-by-block skirmishes centered around ongoing neighborhood changes. By the end of the decade, Inglewood on Chicago's south side would be nearly 100% Black, whereas in the early 1950s, it was nearly 100% white. And then there were the ever-widening so-called generation gaps. Maybe some people were yearning to come together. The Point, as it is known, was a natural choice for such a be-in. Located in Hyde Park, it served as a point of convergence for people of all stripes since its opening in 1937, particularly in the form of weddings. The verdant man-made peninsula jutting off the lakefront, the point was embroiled in the 2000s in controversy due to the city's proposal to replace its limestone embankment with steel and concrete. Much of the lakefront initially had the limestone treatment, but the stones at most beaches had been removed by the 1990s. A Save the Point preservationist movement ensued. Blue Save the Point bumper stickers became ubiquitous from the Midway Plaisance to Hyde Park Boulevard. Preservationists prevailed. I could only find one photo of the 1967 Promontory Point Be-In, published in the July of 1967 issue of Ebony. A dazzling black girl with soft black bangs and smile is walking through the shot. She's wearing a suede poncho and sandals and holding a fistful of daisies. An uncredited photo editorial accompanies the picture. Quote, "But let's forget it. The dream is over. The Be-Ins won't make even a dent in the hate and mistrust and dissension in this country alone. There will be screams of black and white power, the double talk of politicians, the fight over open occupancy, poverty amidst plenty, crime, graft, and double dealing. But on second thought, if you do hear that there's going to be a Be-In in your city, go on out to it. Be a human being for at least one afternoon. Some of it might stick." And so, like a smoke signal, the sentiment of the photo editorial was sent up to the skies. The response came nearly a year later. In 1968, Chicago bore America's scar, a scene where two worlds collided in a jagged mess. In the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., people spilled into the streets in protest, in love, in anger, in desperation, in grief. The city had been simmering for decades, but in 1968, it seethed and boiled. The people cried out for freedom, for hope, for self-determination. Out of the stew came many things, among them a brave new crop of local cultural affairs television programs aimed at Blacks. The day after King's assassination, the West Side went up in flames, and more than 20 city blocks were ultimately decimated. The streets were war-torn. Mayor Daley imposed a curfew for everyone under the age of 21. More than a few young men commandeered rifles from the Sears on Holman Avenue, broken glass crunching beneath leaning soles. The Loop was essentially shut down, with curfews strictly enforced by police. Downtown businesses were paralyzed with fear of such riotous activity spreading virally downtown. It didn't. Similar curfews were implemented in downtown Chicago in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the police-involved killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Like much of the country, in 1968, Black Chicago was cloaked in both anger and grief. Part of the reason that Black Chicagoans felt the assassination of Dr. King so acutely was that he lived in Chicago during 1966 as part of the Chicago Freedom Movement, which activated for open housing. Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, had a particularly powerful arm in Chicago known as Operation Breadbasket. During his time in Chicago, King lived on the West Side and organized multiple actions against restrictive housing covenants and other oppressive housing injustices. The demonstrators often met with violent opposition. In February of 1966, Jet magazine published an article titled "How King Wages War on Slums in Chicago." He had recently moved into his tiny Hamlin Avenue apartment in Lawndale. It had, according to the article, only a handful of furnishings and barely enough heat. The write-up declared that from this threadbare apartment, quote, "King can see the nightmare that was never replaced by his dream." His work in Chicago was setting the groundwork for the Poor People's Campaign. He sought a living minimum wage to mobilize the unemployed into vocations and to capture federal funding for rehabilitation of the slums. Jet noted that local street gangs were, quote, offering protection to King's staff and attending rural retreats where nonviolence as a technique is explained and urged upon the gangs. Some of that training, which included information on community organizing, resurfaced as the vice lords emerged in the 1960s as the conservative vice lords, but the Jet piece made it clear that such rapport wasn't easy to establish. James Orange, then a young organizer with the SCLC, bore the scars of that effort. According to the article, some gang members tested his commitment to nonviolence by jumping him a few times. He never fought back. Jet related that, quote, he bled with dignity. That broke the ice. During his stay in Chicago, King went on Wesley South's radio show on WVON, the most powerful Black station in Chicago at the time. Though not Black owned, at the time it was owned by Leonard and Phil Chess of Chess Records. The station touted a tagline of Voice of the Negro, and in addition to music, it offered public affairs and news programming. On Wesley South's Hotline, as the program was called, Dr. King observed that, quote, the demonstrators have not been the violent ones. They have often been the recipients of violence, but they did not initiate violence. Although there was some discord among the community regarding his methodology, the general feeling was one of respect for King and his dogged determination. In April of 1968, in the days following the assassination, in a small storefront on Chicago's West Side, Otis Spann, a blues pianist and vocalist, recorded a tribute to Martin Luther King. The recording was released on Cry Records. The label was starkly black with block silver print. It was the imprint's only release. There's a quote of lyrics from that song. Yes, fellas, I know you had to heard the news that happened down in Memphis, Tennessee yesterday. There came a sniper, wiped Dr. King's life away. The recording by Otis Spann notes on the label that profits from this record will be donated to the SCLC. Out of the rubble of the uprising and born of fear, a number of Black-focused public affairs shows came to be. The idea was that allowing Blacks a forum to be heard outside of the Black community might retard the growth of another breakdown. It's hard for two parties to truly come together and express their perspectives when one voice is so much louder than the other, but the resulting efforts were at the very least valiant efforts. The rumors were on the day of Dr. King's funeral, Blacks were going to riot, recalled Daddy O'Daly, who was a disc jockey at WMAQ radio in 1968. He asked Warner Saunders, then executive director of the Better Boys Foundation, a popular youth center on the West Side, to be his co-host on a TV program called For Blacks Only. The producer was Vernon Jarrett, who was later a columnist at the Chicago Sun-Times. Saunders once stated that when he started, there were just a few Blacks on the air in Chicago, and he taught himself broadcasting by studying tape recordings he made at home. The public affairs show was initially slated to be a special, but it got such high ratings that local ABC affiliate Channel 7 ran its episodes for 11 years. Warner Saunders later enjoyed a long career as a local news anchor. For Blacks Only was part of a fresh trend of programming that provided positive Black roles on television. The trend was so notable that Ebony covered the topic in 1969 as TV Discovers the Black Man. The article heralded the Black faces seen weekly on primetime hits such as Star Trek, Mission Impossible, and Peyton Place. It also spoke of a flood of Black-oriented programming that was created in the wake of riots that rocked cities across the nation. Perhaps even more notably, by September of 1969, a scant 7 months later, Ebony ran a far less glowing article titled Black TV, Its Problems and Promises. That piece focused less on glossy dramatic roles and more on Black public affairs programming airing in Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, and other cities. Problems and Promises dives into the weeds of Black programming, laying out roadblocks that Black producers dealt with, from the pressure to translate for non-Black audiences and the tiny percentage of station budgets allotted for such shows, to the push and pull between Black creatives and often white directors for control. These issues are still pertinent to makers of Black targeted programming today. However, back then the issue was compounded because the media landscape was far less fractured. That is, national broadcast television consisted solely of CBS, NBC, and ABC, each providing programming to huge swaths of the public at any given time. Even smaller UHF channels commanded a larger market share in the pre-cable age. Today, there are many hundreds of channels, plus streaming programming and narrowcasting to highly targeted slices of the pie. But in 1969, Black entertainment television was science fiction. And even before a Black program could be broadcast, it needed to overcome internal hurdles during the production phase. Strange things can happen when a script enters the hands of a white director, executive producer, and an all-white technical crew, the Ebony article proclaimed. Stranger things happen when the white technicians speak in technical vernacular and the sights and sounds of white magic swirl over the head of a Negro producer for the first time. In Chicago alone, there was For Blacks Only, as well as Jim Tillman's Our People on WTTW, and A Black's View of the News on WCIU. The last was an all-Black nightly news program hosted by Don Cornelius and Roy Woods in the years before Don launched Soul Train as a local dance and music program in 1970, also launched on WCIU. Television was, in that moment, a flickering medium to express what had been bottled up, to voice what had been silent, and yet those flashes of Black light were perishable. One lone lost episode of Our People survives. No trace of a Black's view of the news. Tapes degraded or were destroyed, erased, voices rendered mute again. Yet some city blocks are still seething, and in some cases, particularly on Chicago's west side, the blocks are still dormant. From late 2012 until 2017, I produced a Chicago radio show called The Barbershop Show that broadcast live from Carter's Barbershop in Chicago's Lawndale neighborhood on the west side. Carter's has been a community anchor for decades. We broadcast on Vocalo, a community-focused urban alternative public radio station, and we were rebroadcast on our sister station, WBEZ, which is an NPR affiliate station. The show was hosted by veteran broadcaster Richard Steele during my tenure as a producer, and we welcomed reporters, activists, musicians, politicians, and other community members for deep dive conversations on culture and public affairs issues. We focused primarily on issues impacting Chicago's Black and Brown communities. Our tiny team was afforded editorial freedom, which allowed us to cover stories that otherwise were not getting media coverage without the internal production hurdles that so many Black media makers face during the story pitching process. It wasn't until years later that I considered what we did was a continuation of the mission of that first wave of local Black public affairs programming. In 2013, one episode of The Barbershop Show featured George Daniels, the charismatic owner of George's Record Room. That popular record store and community staple was located for decades on the west side, since George started it in 1969. Though George's was a small store in a field populated at the time by huge chains like Sam Goody, George was very influential in the music industry. He at one time, quote, organized close to 20,000 Black record stores across the country to combat what he saw as injustices towards small Black retailers in the music industry. George shared with us that, quote, the distributors would come to the record store and do displays, like your windows and your walls. He was talking about the record label promotion pieces, like a full-size cardboard cutout of Shaka Khan or an SOS band poster. He went on to say, we would thank them. I was so happy, to get some new stuff. Didn't know they were supposed to pay us, that there was revenue space within our store. That was advertising. So as time had gone on, I joined the White Trade Organization, which is NARM, National Association of Recording Merchandisers. These were the big chains, the Sam Goodies and the Tower Records and so on and so forth. And my fellow small retailers were like, man, that's too big for you. They got like 200 and 300 and 500 stores. To which he replied, well, they started with 1. And so I went in there and all the things they talked about, I scaled it down to 1. And so I befriended some and they would tell me what they were getting from distributors. I said, get out of here. So I put together a little marketing packet for the next meeting me and my fellow Black retailers had with one of the major distributors. I walk in there and we sit around talking and I tell the senior VP, here's something for you to look at. He said, what's that? I said, just something. So he looked over it, eyes popped open. He left the room. He went and told everybody, I guess the staff, and he came back and pulled me out. The senior VP said, George, well, we don't pay for advertising in stores. And I said, you want to rephrase that? Do you know that I'm a member of NARM now? And so they made adjustments and they said, okay, George, we'll take care of you, but just don't say much. Man, I was like Gabriel. I was blowing in horns all across America and I started getting small Black music retailers paid. George wasn't committed to just his fellow Black businessmen, though. On the community level, he organized back to school events and toy drives through the store. Around the time of this visit to the barbershop show, George's music room was shuttered. His focus on a satellite location at Midway Airport, but he still owned the property where the West Side George's music room stood. George was invested in the neighborhood, and his intention was to reopen the original store. That is until one incident broke his heart. Vandals broke in and in short order destroyed what he had built over decades. Reporter Robinson interviewed Daniels for a television news piece that aired footage of the wreckage. This wasn't simply a break-in with some overturned chairs and broken glass, but absolutely gruesome. It looked as though someone had delighted in wreaking utter destruction. He, talking about that moment, it hurt because did nobody come from outside of the community to do that? They were some people within the area. For all the things you assumed that you did, you hired the children, you helped feed many families. I mean, I had sports figures come during Thanksgiving. Everybody benefited. He noted the close-knit nature of his customer base. Richard asked George if anyone had reached out to him to rebuild. George replied, "A number of people are really apologetic. It's really discouraging. I wanted to create a development on that block, like the guy in Harlem, Jeffrey Canada, founder of the Harlem Children's Zone. If he can make a difference one block at a time." Always a community-minded entrepreneur in the tradition of Black Chicago's best and brightest, he felt particularly wounded that this affront came from his own beloved community. George lamented, "We're so depressed over here. When the economy slipped and fell, if you will, we're the ones that are suffering behind it. When you look at our areas, it's like a desert. We have to remember in 1969, when I opened it, it was the year after the riots of Dr. King. And there are still vacant lots in our community that are still sitting vacant since 1968. Let's go fast forward. When Rodney King riots in LA happened in 1992, just as much damage. But you can't even tell. It's all been repaired. Lawndale, the West Side community, has still been paying for the riots of 1968. The West Side location of George's Music Room has yet to reopen." Gus Rickett, founder of Uncle Remus's Chicken, another West Side staple, was also featured on that episode of The Barbershop Show, along with his daughter, Charmaine Alfred, who runs the business today. The youngest of 12 children, she shared that she was not really expected to work in the business. She said, "We had been on the West Side for 50 years. That's our roots, our foundation. But my vision was to just expand the brand and create a system where we could grow. There are so many proud moments I have from taking on the legacy of my parents starting this business." You know, in 2014, when the show aired, we celebrated our 50th year. I'm most proud that all of our hires are from the community. We believe in second chances. And I have a joke, X is a prerequisite to work for us, chuckling. You're an ex-con, you're an ex-addict, you're an ex-something. I often try and instill leadership in them. I have an employee that was homeless about a year or so ago. He came to volunteer to help me clean up one of the stores when we were opening in West Suburban Broadview. And I told him we're going to work his way into a job, and now he's my assistant manager. She reiterated for emphasis, he was homeless a year and a half ago. Her father, Gus Rickett, talked about his deep commitment to the community that supported Uncle Remus Chicken all these years. During the radio show, host Richard Steele mentioned that businesses that take in a lot of cash, like a chicken shack, are at risk for a stick-up. He asked Gus if he'd ever been robbed in their many years in the business. Gus replied with the following story. "We was very liberal for us feeding peoples. This particular night, it was very, very cold, and there wasn't that many peoples on the street. And so this man came to the door, and the door was locked. We was in the back. He knocked on the door. I was sitting back at the counter having a cup of coffee, so I went and opened the door and let him in. And I said, 'Have a cup of coffee?' He says, 'Yes, it's cold out here.' And so having a cup of coffee, he began to talk to me. And he said that he had spent 11 years in penitentiary. And he came out to stick me up. We sit there until daylight, drinking coffee. And he had two guns. When he left one with me. About 3-4 months later, he came back and got it, took the other one with him. Call it what you will, cultural currency, respect, kismet for kindness, whatever you believe, saved Gus from what could have been a violent and pointedly desperate incident. Love for Black people and from Black people prevailed that day. The Ricketts have been in business at that same West Madison location for over 40 years, and at the time of that near miss, they'd been there about 15. And though Uncle Remus opened their first South Side location in 2015, according to Gus, their commitment to the West Side has never wavered. The thing that makes Black Chicago special, and a particularly high concentration on the West Side, is the pattern of migration in Chicago. The first wave of the Great Migration of Black people from the Deep South to Chicago filled in what became known as the Low End or the Black Bottom, a slim band of the South Side in the early decades of the 20th century. The West Side didn't really start becoming an area with a Black majority until the 1950s, and that wave, composed of primarily Mississippians, to Chicago's Lawndale, Douglas Park, Garfield Park, and Austin areas flowed on until the 1970s, long after the migration had slowed to a trickle on the South Side. So in a sense, the migrants' hustle, as well as a certain South Side sensibility and flow, or Southern, I should say, sensibility and flow, are fresher and more uncut on the West Side than in other parts of Chicago. To put it another way, the cultural juice is from tree-ripened fruit. Some blocks even formed Mississippi hometown associations because of such a high concentration of folks hailing from the likes of Sunflower or Grenada. But the West Side is remarkably absent from many discussions of Chicago, both internally and externally. The term South Side becomes shorthand for Black. And even within the hierarchy of Black Chicago, there's an ongoing rift between West Siders and South Siders. Depending on the vantage point, one side or the other never quite measures up. To be fair, all over Chicago, regardless of race, there's a tribal aspect. Folks trying to get a handle on you are prone to ask you what high school you went to, or perhaps what Catholic parish you're from. But between the South and West Sides in particular, there is a strange othering that happens that I consider soul dampening. There's a rift built around time-honored negative regional stereotypes that all too often keep the South and West Sides socially separated. I think that rift holds us all back. The Pan-African movement began because Black people realized that their energy was best spent by utilizing their power and resources collectively rather than separately. Ghana and Haiti are stronger than Ghana or Haiti alone. That's why I use the term Black Chicago, particularly for purposes of this book. It is inclusive of both the West and South Side. I'm gonna do one more little. The West Side is a glorious boxer that's still fighting, scuffed gloves on guard, still bearing the scars of 1968 on its brow, knocked down by factory disinvestment in the third and fifth rounds, still pushing, still hustling. Neighborhoods are still vital with energy, with promise, and with buy-in from community members and from stakeholders like the Better Boys Foundation. The Better Boys Foundation, now BBF Family Services, was started in 1961 on the West Side as a gym with a youth boxing program to keep kids off the streets. When one of the youth from the gym died tragically, the founder, Joe Kelman, realized that boxing was, quote, the lure and not the cure, so the program began to offer social services as well. By the mid-1970s, the Better Boys Foundation staged The Black Fairy, a then popular play by local author Eugene Perkins through its Lamont Zeno Community Theater program. The play was directed by Pomone Rami, a cultural worker who has served as mentor to many, including actor and director Robert Townsend. I talked to Townsend on Reclaimed Soul in the summer of 2018. Here's his statement. Pomone Rami and his wife, Massekwa Myers, they were kind of my first role models because they introduced me to theater at 16 years old. And I was on the West Side doing theater at Lamont Zeno, and I was on the South Side at XBAG, Experimental Black Actors Guild. But Mr. Rami was the one that got me into show business, really, because I was an extra in Mahogany in 1965, because he was casting director and he got us involved. And then he told the casting director for Cooley High in 1976, which was my first speaking part, that they should see me. And so I'm forever indebted to him because he was the one who allowed me to really see what show business was and taste it firsthand. So I kind of go into that, the Black Fairy thing, but it's really inside baseball. So we're just gonna, I think now is a good point to kind of, yeah, right? Nodding? Okay, good nodding. Okay, right on. So, because otherwise it's like, yeah. Are we doing Q&A? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any questions? That wasn't the most welcoming question, but believe me, there are no crazy questions here. It's a safe space. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. There was no main source. I have a personally derived archive that I worked on over a period of 15 years. Part of the experiment for this book was not to use any formal archives at all. So a big chunk of it were original interviews, and also ephemeral material. That was the other thing. I didn't want to use a whole mess of scholarly text. I was actually more interested in what I call immediate publications. So publications that were made in the moment, that were not necessarily made to be, cited by the Academy per se, but told a very specific story that I thought was a little more relevant. Yeah. Which I guess is all of that is weird, right? Like that's not normally how we do things. But I wanted this to really speak to the richness that exists in ephemeral material and that exists in people's basements and that is actually accessible to a whole lot of folks as opposed to, special rarefied academic spaces that unfortunately are not as welcoming as maybe they ought to be in a lot of cases. And now keep in mind, some of my best friends are archivists. So I'm not anti-archive, but I recognize that those spaces are not as welcoming. And it actually worked out well for me because during I was wrapping up the book during the months of the pandemic, and a lot of those spaces were closed to the public. So I was able to do my works cited from my little, archival boxes. I didn't have to, try and figure out any particular details. And during the line edit, they were like, it was very funny because a lot of these items are not on the internet. And so during the line edit, they were like, can you just send me a screenshot of this thing? Because I kind of have to know that it really exists. There's just no other way that I can figure it out. So I would take little photos with my iPhone and send it to them and stuff like that. So, yeah.
I wonder if so people can get a sense of what your archive is like a little bit. I don't know if you want to talk about some specific items. You write very movingly about a copy of the Stacks magazine
Right.
that you picked up. There were things like that.
Yeah. So speaking about the archive, it's very interesting because it wasn't as though it was like I had a wish list of things I wanted to acquire, right? Part of my acquisition was funded by my residency at the University of Chicago. So I had begun in earnest to write, and my residency was based on acquiring this, really formally acquiring an archive, building an archive. That was part of the artistic practice that I wanted to develop in a real way as opposed to haphazardly. I think a lot of folks talk about this book as being a memoir, and I don't know if I railed against it, but I questioned that until I realized that so much of the acquisition process, I'm embedded in it in a way. It's kind of like new journalism, right? I'm all up in it. Me going to Memphis and visiting Shangri-La Records, and behind the counter, there's this issue of Stax Facts, and Stax Facts was I guess you could call it a fan publication that was published by Stax Records. Only went to a few people, and I love Stax, and so without opening it up, and there was no signifier on the cover of what it would be, I just bought it for $100. And back then, let me tell you what, $100 for a magazine was a lot of dough. It's still a lot of dough, but back then, I don't know what made me do that. But I wound up taking it out of the little cellophane sleeve once I got home, and I realized that it was actually a Stax Facts issue dedicated to Operation Breadbasket, which I mentioned here, in Chicago. They did a whole issue that really didn't deal with Stax at all. It dealt with sort of the movement in Chicago. And it's felt very much like a kismet thing. So a lot of my acquisitions, I would argue, were being in the right place at the right time, or somebody, hearing the work that I'm doing and wanting to deposit their materials that they'd acquired over the years with me because they knew I wouldn't just throw it in a box somewhere and forget about it. There's even some reel-to-reel tapes that I reference in here that were given to me by Richard Steele. He was the host of the barbershop show that I mentioned. They were in a CVS bag, and he said, "I'm giving them to you because my family doesn't care." And he just turned 80. So I hope I've done well by him. He actually just texted me and said he really loves the book. So I think he feels good about it. But yeah, I mean, it was important to make sure that these tapes, that in many cases, in that particular instance, they had never been played. Like he recorded them just to record them, which was uncommon in the 1970s. Radio people generally didn't record full interviews, and like just kind of kept them and didn't throw them out, and gave them to me in the year of our Lord 2017 or something. So yeah, it's a very long answer, you guys. Yeah, but you all will get that treatment. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for asking. Because so the term Afro-optimism in the sort of like whatever subtitle of this book, the full title, Energy Never Dies, Afro-Optimism and Creativity in Chicago. Subtitle is one of the last things I wrote, real talk. They're like, you need a subtitle. I'm like, do I? They're like, yeah, you absolutely need a subtitle. And so I was like, well, what about like Afro-optimism and creativity in Black Chicago? They're like, well, you're saying Black twice. I'm like, okay, cool, but I like to say Black. But so we took the Black out, but we kept the Afro-optimism, and here is what they said. This is the press, who was wonderful. I had a wonderful experience with the University of Illinois. They said, well, here's the thing though. You can't just like do a mic drop Afro-optimism and not really outline what you're trying to say, because these Afro-pessimists will eat you alive. I'm like, yo, that's so real. But the thing about the term Afro-pessimism, I totally inserted Afro-optimism in the book as Afro-pessimism became sort of like hot phrase. You know, it wasn't originally in the original OG manuscript as I started. I was really talking more about Black radical imagination, Robin D.G. Kelly's term. Like that was really like sort of the academic phrase that I'd latched onto. But what I realized was every time I hear Afro-pessimism, it made me want to like strangle somebody. It made me so angry, and I couldn't articulate why I was so angry. And, you know, by this point, I'm very embedded into this particular work that to me is so clearly about not just a Pollyanna-ish optimism, but an optimism rooted in the Black experience, which says that what's helping to keep us going is that we have seen the improbable happen time and time again, right? And it might not look great right now. It might feel bleak, but we can't latch on to that. We have to push into possibility, right? So that's sort of the, that's sort of it. I mean, it's definitely sort of, it's actually not exactly the opposite of Afro-pessimism, which as I understand it, is sort of the idea that Black Americans are doomed by the fact of their Blackness. I don't necessarily believe that they're as polar opposite, because I do think that both of them are appropriate reactions to the times, but you definitely can't stay in a space of Afro-optimism and be a part of the progress of a people, if that makes sense. If you believe that from birth we are doomed, then what is the point? Why would you be on the streets? Why would you be, fighting the good fight? But the part that made me angry, and writing this really helped me figure that out. What really made me angry was that in the hierarchy of needs, it's a certain luxury to sort of like wallow in Afro-pessimism, knowing what your ancestors had dealt with to get you to where you are. And also, most of the time when someone is really out here struggling, they're not an Afro-pessimist. Because how can you be an Afro-pessimist and walk 8 blocks to feed your children because you don't have a car and you can't afford, a lift? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's very luxurious to get yourself like a double white latte and talk about being doomed and attending Berkeley. I mean, look, I could go on, and that's based on a true story. But I mean, the fact remains that so many of the stories that I detail in this book are stories that have affirmed me and affirmed my family and affirmed my friends and people that mean something to me and people that I don't even know, and I wanted to consolidate those stories into one space, take it out of the oral history and put it in the printed word. See, everybody gets an answer like that. Anybody? Yes, sir. No such thing. Oh, absolutely. Do you want to see a photo? With my hand on it? Ooh, that's a good question. I believe I was just record shopping and I saw it. And I immediately, because I was already engaged in this research, there it is. There's my fingers. See? Every photo in here is from my archive, my personal collection. Made it cheaper, right? But yeah, so like in terms of that record, I read it and it told the story. It said profits from this record will be donated to the SCLC. The writer of the flip side, one side says a tribute to Martin Luther King. It's attributed to Muddy Waters. And it was like, oh, well, obviously that's what this record is, right? And, then part of what I tried to do with this book was take these ephemeral objects and uncover usually three sides of the story, right? So sort of the story of the actual physical recording that's in my hand, right? Secondly, the story as I understood it, right? And then the actual story of the making of that thing. But then also, generally speaking, I wanted to talk about sort of what that record meant to people. Because, from the ethnomusicological point of view, that's also extremely important to me and impossible to unwed from this. Like, I'm as interested in what a member of Earth, Wind, and Fire has to say about a record as I am about somebody who has a really compelling story about the first time they heard September in the basement of St. Sabina's Church in 1978, right? Like, I'm just as interested in that, in the way that these works function in the world. See? Yes. So, like, I'm not allowed to have a one bedroom anymore. Like, that's over. Most everything is in my second bedroom. And because most of the space is occupied by records, it's mostly shelves of records. And really, to be fair, it's not 9,000 LPs, because I know when you imagine 9,000 LPs, like, that's like crazy town. It's in fact 50% LPs and 50% 45s. So the 45s are in cute little boxes from the Container Store. Actually, I feel like I should get an endorsement deal from the Container Store because they're really great for getting cute, like acid-free accoutrement to keep your stuff right. So basically that's it. A whole series of, sort of like archival boxes and records. And there's some other stuff that I have on walls so I can live with them, framed with the UV and all that good stuff. So it's not that exciting. But when people come to my house, they're always like, it's the Museum of Black Love in something. I don't know what they have this whole term that they use, which I think I should get some t-shirts made up for it.
Now, with that said, what floor are you on?
Definitely second floor. Now here's the key. This is important. This is a 19. Yeah. For sure, but none of them are in one place. So the key, in case you're interested in this sort of thing, is you can only put so many things on one shelf, right? And you need to make sure that those joists are happy. So X amount per wall is usually the math that I use. That works pretty well. I haven't had any issues. And the actual bookshelves that I use, like I think 2 of them are like straight up steel, the sort that you might have in a garage. That's where the 45s are because they're just the right size for that. And in terms of the LPs, They came from a guy who used to be an editor at Downbeat, who, when he sort of like downsized, I bought them from him. They were custom built, solid wood, really pretty. Yeah. I actually got them before I started working at Downbeat. A little bit of foreshadowing for you. Yes.
So, reading your book and listening to you talk, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, I'm really interested in the question of nostalgia
Okay.
and how this works. Because so much when you read the book, what's interesting is you talk about this energy, these things people have done, and all of this, and you look particularly, I think, at a lot of sort of the revolutionary moments that are happening in the 60s and 70s especially, but you go back further too, and you know, a lot of folks that I read who work on these kinds of things, sometimes you really feel a nostalgia in that they think, well, it kind of happened in the past, and it was there. And I'm wondering, you know, even in your example about George's record group, right? Like, how do you avoid being nostalgic for like George's record group and what it was, the place that it played in the community, and not just getting trapped in that nostalgia? Like, how does that come to me now? Or how do you square that circle? Like, and bring it into the present?
I just think, you know, working in public radio and telling lots of stories over many years, what I realize is the story is not sort of that polished, you know, final product, like happy ending thing. Like, that's not the story. The story is the perseverance and the struggle and the wins juxtaposed against the losses, right? Because without the losses, the wins, I don't want to say they're meaningless, but they aren't as sweet, maybe. So there's always that element. I was saying to you earlier, David, that ever since I was a little kid, I loved like historical movies, like even if they were horrible movies, but I was always like, this isn't realistic. This is like totally fake. Like, all they did was put on clothes and cars, and they're not really paying attention to the accuracy of what that moment felt like. And I was always just super engaged in that element of it. And part of it might be because I've been engaged in sort of a laissez-faire archival practice since I was a teenager. And I was always really attracted to magazines and different things that really sort of give you the breadth and depth of a moment in a way that historical, like works that are made to detail history, generally don't do. Like, the immediacy of a Life magazine in 1967 is very different from even a television show that came out in 1967, because it's going to give you a very glossy version of what that moment was like, you know. So I was always interested in, maybe, I don't want to say, and it's not even so much that I wanted it to be salacious, right? But what I know is that it feels more real when it's not, powdered in print. Yeah. That's always a challenge, though, because, okay, so dig it. So, like, there's a lot of people. Part of the reason why I wrote this book, the real talk, I'm going to give you all the real talk. Part of the reason why I wrote this book is there's actually a number of nonfiction books that have been written in the, past 5-10 years that really dig from this mine of 60s, 70s Black art and culture and politics and all of that come out of Chicago. Like, I guess it's really sexy, right? Somebody else wrote a book about Black soul music. And I felt like none of them got it right. And part of why none of them got it right was because they weren't looking at the story sort of in an agnostic approach, where they're talking about the business owners, they're talking about the people making music, and all these people are speaking in conversation with each other, which is the way that culture works, right? It's not in a vacuum. But the other reason why they didn't get it right is because, shout out Zora Neale Hurston, they weren't in the community, right? Like, they didn't have the entree to really get the real stories. So, like, when you know that you're getting the real stories, there's a certain level of, I don't know, responsibility attached to that. Because it's like, okay, so I showed you, excuse my French, my whole ass, and I'm trusting that you're going to tell the story right. Maybe it's not the most flattering story, but it feels true to me. That's always the highest form of I don't know, flattery, but appreciation that I've gotten when I've, interviewed people for whatever purpose, that it felt true. Yes.
So, can we talk about that? Like that, the feeling true?
Yeah.
Which is something that,
Yeah.
and you talked about buying the,
Mhm.
the stack.
Mm-hmm.
And like, when $100 was, like, I don't know.
Shoot.
But, so, the feeling true, which is, I think, something that we, like this afternoon, for those of you who are in here, I see you, like, we felt it, right? We felt it in this essay of Why I Write. We felt the truth.
Uh-huh.
And the bare ass of it.
Right.
And yet, are being able to articulate that,
Right.
right? In a way too, I think, in an academic setting that has validity.
Right.
And now I just got lost. I'm looking for the question I'm trying to ask. So, how did you, as a writer, trust that, hear that, and say, I can do this, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to do it, even though some people are going to call it a memoir, and it's not exactly, like, even though it's this new thing.
Right.
How did you find that?
So in journalism, I've worked at WBZ for, God, Jesus Christ, 16 years, right? So the summer I graduated from here, I started there immediately. One of the discussions that happens a lot is about bias and about whether things should be biased and whether you should insert yourself and all these other things. Like, there's a lot of conversation about that in journalism. And I always thought I was into the new journalism from the beginning. So insertion was no problem for me. Like, let's do it. Shout out Joan Didion. But I think in terms of like whether I could do it or not, what I realized was I had sort of an uncommon adjacency to a lot of these old school cats, right? Like that were really in short order going to start passing away, and had some really amazing stories that I knew hadn't really been detailed, hadn't been laid down right? I had trust from community members, community buy-in into what I was doing, and a lot of the younger people too. So like, I didn't talk about it in this reading, but I was a teacher for a space called U Media, and like Chance the Rapper and No Name and all these other people. I've known them since they were teenagers. Like, a lot of the musicians that right now are at the top of sort of the Chicago music scene, I have real deep lasting relationships with. So it's like, well, who else? Let's be cliche. If not now, when? If not me, who? Like, who would it be? So there was that. But yeah, I mean, after I've been working in radio for a very long time, I've been interviewing people for a very long time. And again, people can hear an interview all day long and think it's great. But when the person feels like, I think of it like a portrait, right? I mean, sometimes there's a very flattering portrait that doesn't really look like you, but it's very flattering. But sometimes there's a portrait that really captures your essence in a way that you feel good about. It might not be the most flattering portrait, but yes, they got the nuance of what I am or what I'm about. That was what I was trying to capture, and that's what I always aim for. Yeah, I mean, I think that is like kind of the thing that makes me the most excited, being able to capture it. But you have to look past the words sometimes and look at the intent, if that makes sense. Because people will say lots of words, but what are they really trying to communicate to you in terms of what's important to them? What was really driving them? What they regret? Like, that's also something that I really, a lot of these people are no longer, well, not a lot, but a good number of the major interviews in here, people are no longer with me. So, or with us. So they had hindsight to be able to talk about some things that maybe for years they weren't able to talk about, And so you have to treat that very delicately. like respectfully, like however much they're willing to engage, you just pull from that, because I do think that when things get messy is when the writer inserts themselves in a way that they're mangling the narrative. And that happens a lot, like he didn't say that. He said this. This is what he said. There's a lot of like verbatim in this because I didn't want to mess it up. And they actually, if you read the words, they are telling you exactly. I don't need to summarize it. I don't need to do close reading. They said what they said. They repeated something for a reason. I kept that repetition, that rhythm of the way that they spoke, which I guess goes back to the radio and the editing sound. I think that's probably something that's idiosyncratic about this versus if I had originally composed this based on just written word and for written word, as opposed to most of these conversations existed in a recorded format, whether for radio or not, before they were printed. So, yes.
See, these archives, right?
Yeah.
This is like fascinating to me because you talk about like, people collect, we send the archive, there's the archives in the academy.
Right?
But you have these archives.
Correct.
You have things that nobody else has. What did it, like, have you thought, do you know where I'm going with this? Like, have you thought about like what happens to it?
I mean,
Right? Where do they go?
right.
When it could disappear. Those tapes.
Yeah, where are they gonna go? I mean, I have me and my lay archive people friends. We talk about that a lot. I mean, I'm pretty confident that most of it will stay together. I don't know. I don't have a particular plan. I don't really want them to go to a university, nothing university, but I want them to be, I would rather if they go anywhere, they go to the Woodson Regional Library, which is a public library in Chicago, because at least it would be accessible to people who are, kind of just citizens. That would be my goal. And plus they're so sweet. They're wonderful people. Great. So, yeah. But yeah, the archive, man. I'm into the archive. I think it's exciting, the idea. And also, I mean, part of what probably got me into the archive in the first place, because now archives are hot, right? Like, I mean, all of these things like started getting hot. Like when I was doing it, nobody cared. But yeah, when what's exciting about the archive, or what activated my interest in it, was there was this sort of prevailing wisdom, quote unquote, that everything was on the internet, everything you could Google, right? I mean, we know that Googling is not a great way to access scholarly sources. Like, we know that part. But this idea that, somebody scanned that at some point, Google Books, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, what I was realizing very quickly was that was false. And it was especially false when you are dealing with things that maybe aren't like the hottest topic out here. Those things definitely weren't scanned, and things that maybe didn't have the level of aesthetic interest, or visual interest, they definitely weren't scanned. So I could say, like, for instance, this cover, right? My press asked me what I wanted on the cover, and I knew immediately this was it. And this image is actually a high quality scan that I did from an Ebony magazine, because I thought it was beautiful. And the only place where the photo existed, I mean, you can kind of Google it, like you can find it, but like in a large format, was this dude's house, right? Like his father had owned a black advertising firm, one of the very first in the country. He had the photos. I found that man's Facebook and phone number. I told the press, here's how you get in touch with him. It's either Facebook or phone number, which gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. And so 2 months had passed by. And I'm like, I go to the art director of the press and I'm like, yo, what's going on? Chuck or whatever. And Chuck's like, yeah, we're waiting on him to send us a high quality scan during a global pandemic. The man has a phone number and a Facebook. I'm saying that we'll be waiting our whole natural life to do that. I'm just gonna go ahead and take one for the team, buy a scanner and scan it my darn self. And that makes sure it's be damned. Here we are. Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, I was gonna say nobody's encountered my archive, but that's not true. I have done a part of my exhibition. Part of my residency at the University of Chicago was actually a preliminary exhibition of these pieces, like often that are dealt with in this book. Some of the highlights, and so it was set up at a gallery space, and this is old Jet magazines, old records, and just all sorts of things like advertisements from old Black businesses, just really beautiful mid-century imagery, most of which was sort of about self-determination, identity, Black is beautiful, that sort of stuff, right? But again, almost all of it was material that at one point might have been headed for the trash bin, right? Like this wasn't stuff that was super, super valuable. It could be rare, but not valuable necessarily to most people. So I set it all up in a way that was cool, painted the walls, which was a whole thing. They're like, you can't paint the walls. I'm like, I'm painting the walls. Notably in that gallery space, every exhibition since, tell me why they put something on the walls. Yeah. Anyway, so I set it all up and I had to work. So I couldn't just be in the space. And so there were no docents. So I taught the security guards how to be docents. And I was like, here's why I did this work. And if people ask questions, please do me a solid and forward those questions and statements to me because I just really want to know. And so one that really sticks out is that one of the security guards was like, yeah, this woman came in and she just stood and looked around for a really long time. And she said to me, it's like seeing a part of me that I thought was dead. And here it is, alive. And that's kind of like what the point of the book is, right? Like, I'm not trying to sort of eulogize anything. What I'm saying is that the exciting energy that's in these things not only are still latent and here and promising, but it is in fact inspiring a whole nother generation of creative people that are working in Chicago today. Yeah. So, I think that's probably the headline. There's other things. What I think is really cool is how many people are excited just to get a mention. And that was another conversation. They were like, I don't understand why you're listing 8 people every time you're mentioning something happening. It's like, why are you mentioning these people? I'm like, this is the only time they're ever going to be written down for this thing that they did in 1972. If it takes me 2 more words of my word count, it's worth it to me that they're included in this. And that was hard for people to understand. But I'm like, yo, we're talking about people's life's work. And this is my one crack at the bat too. And I would have hated for somebody to talk about, I don't know, whatever moment I was engaged in, and they don't even mention my name. That would be, kind of sad. Because you feel like you're part of this larger thing in your heart, but here is some proof on a piece of paper that someone else recognized it 45 years after the fact. Or somebody's kids see their parents, and something that their parents maybe never even really talked about here being heralded and celebrated. Yeah. Revisionist history, but better. Anybody? Somebody? No? I'm giving these very long answers, so it's more A than Q. It could be not about this book, though, too. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk just briefly about your practice actually as a visual artist, as someone who also does assembly.
Okay. So you were funny about this yesterday because part of the thing, I'm into collage work and assemblage. And part of that is, maybe I feel a kinship with those sorts of artists because they also are about the archive, right? They build an archive, and sometimes, as my father, who's a visual artist, mentioned in our conversation last night, they might be acquiring things and not even know how to use them, and so they put them, they put things aside with the hope that one day. But yeah, I think in terms of visual work, I'm really interested, I mean, surprise, surprise, in activating things that might have been thrown away before in interesting ways. Um, the one piece that you mentioned, it's called ancestor worship. And so it's basically like a Queen Anne table with very curved legs. And on the Queen Anne table sits a flat top, tabletop Victrola, which actually still works. Got it from the Salvation Army. And right directly on top of that, in short order, is like a crank turntable, or yeah, crank turntable in like a suitcase configuration. And directly on top of that is a mounted, I guess you would call it like gramophone arm. And at the bell of the arm is a mask from Cameroon. So it actually looks like sort of a pot-bellied sculpture. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was trying to speak to how records interface with like family and generational discourse and sort of keep stories alive. But I was trying to do a visual representation of that. So I don't know, whatever, right? It was kind of cool because, you know, it's an opportunity to communicate things without so many words. Yeah. Ooh, hand back there, and then I got you up here. Yes. Well, recently someone told me I'm a memory worker. I'm like, yo, that is it. That's exactly right. That's the short term. Like, I love that phrase. It's funny because when I was down here, like I think it was the sort of the tail end of the period where you picked a job or a career or a path and you did that path, right? Like, I just feel like in the years since then, the idea of being a multidisciplinary artist, now everybody's multidisciplinary, right? Like, that wasn't expected back then. Like, you had like one primary vocation, and then maybe on the side, you might also paint, or you might also be a musician or something. But those things usually weren't built into a I don't know, like bound together practice. And I think, I don't know, I guess from the very beginning, all of the things I was engaged in all felt like extensions of the same inquiry. So I didn't have the language to call it multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or anything like that, but the way that it unfolded is, I guess, that. What was the other question? I was doing good, right? Yes, okay. So like in terms of genre, that's another one. I do feel like, I don't know, I was here at the right time because it was like I was just about to graduate. I was so a senior, ready to bounce. And somebody said nonfiction literature to me. I was like, what? Is that a thing? Like, because creative writing was like, I don't know about creative writing. But the concept of nonfiction literature, because I was English lit, right? So like nonfiction literature was exactly what I wanted to do. You know, whether it be it through sound or through print, like that was exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, I think entering into the world of English language, and I was initially attracted to literature because I loved the floweriness of it, right? It's gorgeous. But as I was doing these sorts of writings, because I've been writing, you know, in earnest since my first story I found was from 5th grade, which is very cute. It was surprisingly detailed. But the first time, I think high school was when I was really, really actually practicing writing. And I was always interested in writing historical fiction. And in order to make it real, I would look up, like, what was the toothpaste that people were using in 1964? I wanted that to be right. What were the cars? Okay, great, perfect. That's what it is going to be. We're going to do like all of those little details, right? And that would be through looking through old magazines or through this or through that. But yeah, I mean, I think that part of it was the nonfiction literature part of it it gave me the language to describe the way I was approaching writing. I mean, definitely new journalism felt right to me, but I never really considered myself a journalist. I mean, not in the traditional sense, because I feel like that's low-key disrespectful to people who went to J school, right? Like, that's not what I did. But I am still a cultural writer for like journalistic publications of record. So I want to apply that level of rigor to everything that I'm writing. Yeah. The other part I'll add to that is part of why I didn't go into fiction, because I mentioned this earlier, is that honestly, I thought like these real stories that I was encountering were way more interesting than anything I could come up with. That was just real. I mean, a couple of them were okay, but yeah. Truth is stranger than fiction, as they say. Yes.
Okay, this might be a personal question.
Here we go.
So, what is your most valuable record?
He's really in this, right?
And why is it valuable to you? If
Well-
it's not the most expensive, or the most you paid for, or the most important.
Yeah.
Personally valuable to you.
I mean, here's the thing, like, I don't know that I could really ascribe a most valuable record, even sentimental. I think I'm just not a super sentimental person, like in that sense where it's like, oh my God, I could never part with this, because it happens, right? And in order to work in the material space, you have to be kind of at peace that this might be the last moment you spend with this thing beyond your control. Like, that's just the way that it is. I will say that there are certain things that I do attribute a level of value to because I know what it took to acquire them, and I know that I could never acquire another one. So like, there's a record, I had a friend, we worked on a non-profit board together, and he kept saying, oh, come get these records. My wife won't let me play records anymore, blah, blah, blah. They're just in the basement. And I was like, okay, I will. Time elapses, and he pulls up in a Prius, and he opens up his trunk, and it's just like boxes of records, and some of them are like drenched, and he's like, I had a flood, you have to get these records now. And I'm like, Jesus, Mary and Joseph. And so it was like, he apparently in the early 80s, he knew like a record distributor guy who dealt with the cutouts. So the cutout records were the ones that didn't sell, right? And they also, to this day, are generally the ones that are worth the most money because they didn't sell. So he had all these like minty, like jazz and African and really cool records, some of which I kind of had to like sort of blow dry and kind of like take them out of their sleeve. That's the key. If they're ever in a flood, take them immediately out of their sleeve, because once they stick in the sleeve, that's very hard to reverse. So it's just PSA. But anyway, one of the records I got out of it was on the Black Jazz label, one of the rarest records on that label. I think at this point it's selling for about $1,000. I would have never encountered the record had he not had it. And I enjoy the record very much, but I never ever would attempt to replace it if anything happened to it. So I think that's the one, like if there was a fire or something, I would like grab that one. There's like a couple other ones where I was like, well, I mean, just, for posterity's sake, me being a good steward over things, I would want to grab that one for sure. Yeah, it's far out watching what some of this stuff is selling for these days. It's kind of outrageous because it was literally free. Not that I'm trying to retire, although the thought has crossed my mind, cash out my chips and move to Fiji. So, I think of the value as being more about the collection itself, because and I think that about collections in general, because you can't replicate a collection. A collection is a reflection of the collector. So my collection actually is a series of collections. Like, there's the stuff that I have bought individually, but then there's the man who was a DJ at Yale, like the Yale radio station in 1965 to 1967. He had this amazing collection of Impulse and Blue Note. Everything that you're imagining is he had all of them, like all of them in alphabetical order. And his wife had me just come grab them as she moved to be with her daughter in Philadelphia. So like I keep those together, and when I play them, they have a nice little WYBS stamp. I talk about him, you know. So like the collection of the collector's collection, you know, is also something that is very important to me to try and at least keep a little bit of that narrative attached to that thing. Yes. I mean, a little bit. I mean, it's in here, right? It's a little bit. I mean, it's not, I mean, yeah, I think I could be talking about that part of it all day long. I think, yeah, because that's what attracts me to the material culture anyway, right? There's a certain, I mean, you can glean a lot of information from a scan, right? Or from digitization of something. But there's something very special, not just of getting someone else's thing, but about the acquisition process that includes, tell me about your grandfather, right? Tell me about your son, you know. Probably my favorite story that is not in this book, that is sort of relatable, but not really. There was a person by the name of Dr. Willie Barrow, who was a big civil rights advocate Reverend in Chicago, and passed away a few years ago. And I just kept getting, this is what happens to me. I get a whole bunch of like text messages and calls, come to this estate sale. You need to be at this estate sale. Like literally, I'll be in bed, minding my own business. You need to be at this estate sale today. Right? So I went to the estate sale, and it was like, for lack of a better concept, God was guiding my hands. Like, I'm just going to get sort of a snapshot of this collection of records based on how I see it, right? Like, I knew I couldn't buy all of them, but I'm like, okay, what's a representative snapshot of this collection? And so I grabbed a lot of them. The records belonged to Dr. Willie Barrow's son, Keith Barrow, who was a vocalist for the Operation Breadbasket, Jesse Jackson Collective back in the day, and then went off to seek fame and fortune as sort of a disco vocalist in the 70s. So these records, I did a little research, and what I found out is that he was one of the very first AIDS casualties in the entertainment world in Chicago around 1983, 1984. So she got these records from him. They had been in New York City, and she boxed them up, and she never opened them. But she kept them until she died. She also became one of the very first people involved in the clergy and in the, you know, religious circles in Chicago to really advocate for gay rights and for AIDS awareness and all those things before it was even like something that people would go out on a limb to do if they didn't absolutely feel compelled to do. It was a sad time. So anyway, I got these records, and I knew that they had not been played in many, many, many years. And I took them to my house, and I'm playing them, and there was so much joy in these records. Some of them were his own records. Like, they were his copies of records that he put out. And they also told his story. So part of when I say I'm trying to collect a representative collection, they had a lot of notes that he wrote. One of them had notes circling a producer that he wound up working with. So maybe someone gave him this record as reference. One of them was a LaBelle record where there's a track called Going Out to California, I think, or something like that. And it was cut out of the inner sleeve. And I imagined that he had cut it out and pasted it up in his room before he went off to seek fame. And that was something that was important to him, and he kept that record. So yeah, playing these records that were his, including records with his voice on it, was a super heavy, 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 heavy experience, right? Because it's like liberating this work. And then sort of the nice little addendum to the story is there was only one time I DJ'd them kind of as a collection. And it was for a gathering that was being put together for nurses in AIDS care. And that wasn't like, oh, I'm going to do this thing, but it was like someone reached out to me and was like, yo, we want you to do this event. And I'd had these records, and I was like, you know what? I feel like he would have loved, and she would have loved for these records, because they're disco and they feel good and they're soul, for some people that are really doing the Lord's work to celebrate to these records, you know? So I don't know. I think sometimes like activating an archive in that way is more important than the act of collecting. It's making it mean something to people.
Right, that's where it's not nostalgia anymore.
Right.
Like its force comes into the world in a new way. It
Right.
opens something up instead of closing something down.
Exactly. No, it's not like, you know, we were a country then, like a proper country. It's not like, you know, the sort of a precious approach to what was before. Like, I always think of old stuff in terms of how to activate it and utilize it today. You know, like I'm not interested in 1960s cosplay. And I loved 60s, man, it's my jam. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in, oh, this thing is an amazing piece of art, regardless of time. And it's not necessarily timeless, right? It might very well speak to its moment in an indelible way. But I think that moment and that work is worth elevating and is worth being elevated today. Yeah. So that's why I'm not like, because that's the point, right? Like, I mean, the point isn't to say those were the good old days. Like, what value is that? I mean, I guess somebody might think there's a value to that, but we're still moving forward, right? And we still have all of these things. I think a lot about sustainability, right? Like, people keep making plates. Like, why are you making plates? Do you understand there's enough plates for all of us that were made before 1975? We don't ever have to make another plate again. And yet you go to Target, right? Every single goddamn plate. Like, how many plates do we need? How many of these things do we need? Why do we keep replicating things for the sake of the new? I mean, that's like an unanswerable question, but it's a question that future generations are going to be grappling with based on necessity. You know, we have the luxury to kind of cross our legs and drink our like triple white lattes and talk about that now, but those times are, you know, it's closing in on us. So understanding sort of like being comfortable with an aesthetic of something that has been here before is also something that I really try and champion in my work. Imperfection, like honest imperfection. That's it. As opposed to planned obsolescence. Boo. I still have an iPhone 6. It's a 6S, but still 6.
Maybe as a final question, can you tell us something about your next projects? Where do you go from here?
Definitely not about Chicago. And I don't have a problem with Chicago. Obviously, I live in Chicago, but this other one actually is also, it's building a different archive. It's actually a different archive that's speaking about sort of more aesthetic things, but it's a very different book. This book doesn't actually detail, it talks about some visual things, but it isn't really rooted in the aesthetic. This other one is more dealing with like Black aesthetic. That's all I can say. Embargo. Kidding, there's no embargo. If you know an agent.
Well, please join me in thanking Ayana Contreras.